The Palestinians are incredibly organized. I mean, I've seen documents that were sent out to Students for Justice for Palestine across the United States on October 7th already, where they basically had the playbook for the encampments. They had all of the messaging. They had the idea of, sort of taking over areas of campuses. They were ready for this.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. Two headlines from the same network, nearly a month apart. Fuel reserves at Gaza hospitals likely to run out in 24 hours. Nearly a month later, Gaza faces communications blackout due to a lack of fuel. It's easy to explain why Gaza's hospitals didn't actually run out of fuel at the start of the war. Gaza's government, Hamas, was hoarding enough fuel to circumnavigate the globe in a Boeing 747. And it drip-fed enough fuel to the hospital to keep them operational, to use them as human shields. But how do we explain how the media got it so totally wrong and fell for Hamas's scam? How did the media not learn its lessons and keep running with Hamas talking points as laundered by the United Nations? Lahav Harkov is the ultimate media insider, the senior political correspondent for The Jewish Insider, and former senior diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. For over 15 years, she has reported from the hallways of power for international audiences from Israel, and that makes her the perfect person for an insider conversation about why the international media seems to get so much wrong about this country. Answering questions like, why is the international media so obsessed with this tiny strip of land? And how can Israel work to make its case to the world in an often hostile media landscape? Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon. What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Lahav Harkov, welcome to State of a Nation.
Thanks for having me on the show.
The first Israeli journalist to have interviewed J.D. Vance, possibly the next vice president of the United States.
That's my new claim to fame, apparently.
Tell me about that.
He was in Israel in the summer of 2022. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, did an event in Israel. And the headliner was Ben Shapiro. And the Israeli media was very excited about Ben Shapiro. And I was invited to cover, and they had a little sort of VIP reception in the beginning. And I saw that J.D. Vance was there. I recognized him. And I asked the organizers, could I interview him? And they were like, sure.
This was before he was a United States senator.
He was running for Senate at that point. But of course, he had already written a best-selling book that was made into a movie.
Hillbilly Elegy.
Hillbilly Elegy. Glenn Close might have been nominated for... Yeah, the movie came out almost 2 years before that. So Glenn Close had been nominated for an Oscar. I knew he was a big deal. But apparently, Israelis who are not Israeli Americans didn't know he was a big deal. So I'm the only Israeli to have interviewed him, it seems.
And this is really what I want to talk to you today in this conversation about the media landscape in Israel, specifically the international media in Israel and the role that it has played in this war. Because you straddle a very interesting line. On the one hand, you are an Israeli journalist. You worked before for an Israeli outlet, the Jerusalem Post, in English, but an Israeli outlet. You're an Israeli citizen. But you're writing in English. You're writing now for Jewish Insider, which is an American publication. And so you sort of straddle that line between a local journalist and an international journalist. And I'm wondering what you notice as being, at the macro level, the major differences between the Israeli media landscape and the international media landscape. What you notice is different here from how things are done abroad.
Well, if we're talking about how things are done, I think a lot of the differences are just societal differences in the level of informality in Israel, where I could call up someone who's very important on the phone or just text them.
No need to show off.
But
we know you're very important. That's why you're on the podcast.
But I could do that within a month of, starting to be a reporter in the Knesset, it maybe took a little bit of chutzpah, but you could do that, in a way.
There's nothing you can't do in this country without a little bit of elbow grease.
Exactly. In a way that in America, I think is not as easy, and that people just aren't as accessible. The VIPs are not as accessible in the United States, and I imagine in the UK, even though I have less experience with that. In terms of the media landscape, the consumers and the kind of media, I think in some ways, it's very different from what American media was, I think, until maybe the past decade to 15 years. And now American media has become more like Israeli media. I think that,
In what sense?
That they wear their biases a lot more openly in the US, and Israel has long been like that. And maybe a little bit more, the chutzpah, like we talked about, the Israeli chutzpah, that using like sort of, I don't want to say coarse language or not cursing, but like everyday language, even in the quote unquote good newspapers in a way.
It's interesting you say that the Israeli media wears its biases on its sleeves, because I was born in the UK, and in the UK, the press is openly partisan. They will the newspapers will endorse candidates in a general election in a way that in Israel they would never do explicitly.
So, because I think that in Israel, in general, people look to America as a model for a lot of things. And I think to some extent that's true of the media as well. So that, well, first of all, in the early decades, all the newspapers in Israel, or almost all of them, were party newspapers, right? They were affiliated with Labor, or they were affiliated with the National Religious Party, or et cetera. And the National Religious Party comes to mind because their newspaper sort of still exists with its Makor Rishon, even though it's no longer affiliated with a party. But the other affiliated newspapers don't really exist. Anyway, but starting in the 1980s or so, they modeled themselves more after America, that they aren't specifically affiliated. And yet, you read in news reports, and you see it on TV too, the kind of language that they use, the facial expressions. I don't know if you've interviewed Eylon Levy, she's an interesting person, but you can see by the way she lifts an eyebrow what she thinks about anybody. And so you still had that sort of Israeli personality, that Israeli chutzpah, like shine through. The UK is like its own, it's just so different from American media. And it's true, like they have affiliated media the way Israel used to have, I think.
Well, look, let's crack on, because there is a war raging, and I want to understand from you, as someone who straddles this line, how the international media has been acting in this war. I'll start off with a question that I think is on many people's minds. The international media does seem a little bit obsessive about Israel, doesn't it? Do you agree with that?
I do, yeah. I think it's like one of these almost like eternal questions, right? It's why the Jews? And, Israel is the Jew of nations. There are things that are unique about Israel other than it being Jewish, right? The conflict with the Palestinians has certain sort of unique factors about it, right? And the situation in Judea and Samaria being unsettled for more than half a century is unique. That being said, there are all kinds of interesting and unique conflicts happening all over the world that aren't getting as much attention. And so I think it's this sort of like open question of why the Jews, and even if people aren't aware of it.
Do you think that's the question, that it is a historical obsession with the Jews, or is it simply the fact that Israel offers foreign correspondents an opportunity to report on a war zone and then file their report from an air-conditioned aroma and then go out for drinks in Tel Aviv in the evening, and the sort of comfort that you simply could not have if you were covering Iraq or Sudan, which is experiencing a humanitarian crisis on a much, much larger scale? What explains that obsession?
I think that's an element as well. It's a lot easier to cover the conflict in Israel than it is to cover other places, because it's a lot easier to live comfortably in Israel and be an hour away from a war zone, right? And most other war zones aren't like that. Ukraine, some parts of Ukraine could be a little bit like that, although it's a much bigger country, so the distances are greater.
And Ukraine, I know that journalists there talk about the struggle to keep Ukraine in the news, and yet it doesn't look like there's any struggle to keep this war in the news. And so I just get back to this question of why you think that 10 months into a war, it continues to capture global media attention and hasn't receded in the way that other conflicts have.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no one answer. I think that there's so many different elements to it. I think, if you look in the United States, there's a lot of people with interests, whether in favor of Israel or not in favor of Israel, who have interests to keep this at top of the news, right? You have the Jewish communities and the hostage families who want to keep the hostages top of mind, and they want to make sure that military aid to Israel keeps flowing. And then you have the people who are anti-Israel who want to put negative things about Israel in the news all the time. And
that's an important point, that having Israel in the news is not necessarily a bad thing, because we do have goals that we want to achieve in this war, namely bringing all the hostages back, shoring up international support to bring down the Hamas terror regime. And that is something we do want to see in the news.
Correct. So I think that there's just like a lot of things happening at the same time. And you'll see that there are weeks, right, where they're talking about Israel much less. Right now, when we're speaking, which is, the Republican candidate Trump was almost assassinated, and it's the Republican National Conference, and next week is the Olympics. Like, unless something very big happens here, I don't think the attention's going to be on us for the next couple of weeks. There'll still be news about Israel, of course, especially because, all these news companies have invested in Israel, right? They all have people here, not as many as they did in the beginning of the war, but there's still a lot of foreign correspondents here. But I still think we're not going to be top of mind right now unless something big happens. So it fluctuates as well.
And yet there is this general impression that the international media is hostile towards Israel, not only critical, but openly hostile or biased. I'm wondering, as an avid consumer of news as well, is that an assessment you agree with?
Yes. Hostile might be going a little too far, but I think that they're deeply skeptical. I think skepticism is an important characteristic for journalists. There's a journalism cliche: if your mother tells you she loves you, fact check it. So it's not bad to be skeptical per se, but I think that they don't have that same skepticism for the other side. I think they've fallen into a sort of victimhood narrative of the Palestinians, where because Israel is a state with a strong army, they just can't wrap their minds around the facts that that any Palestinians could be the bad guys here, including Hamas, because they just see them as important things. I think...
No, hang on. I want to understand. I mean, Hamas, the jihadi death cult that perpetrated the October 7th massacre and is still holding 120 hostages, you're telling me journalists don't understand that they are the bad guys? I mean, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Right. So they'll say October 7th was bad, right? I think most... unless you're talking about people who are really extreme, will say October 7th was bad. But then they'll want to talk to you about root causes, the occupation, et cetera. And then one more thing that I wanted to talk about is that in general, again, it's a cliche, but it's for a reason. Journalists tend to be more left-leaning. And right now, the political left around the world is sort of coalescing against Israel. I mean, the protests on the street are not, in most cases, coming from the far right. They're coming from the far left. And I mean, there are plenty of liberals who are pro-Israel, right? And it depends which countries we're talking about, et cetera. But I think that if we're talking in generalizations, these are people who, when they look at who they agree with politically, those are people who are not very supportive of Israel right now. That might not have been the case, 40 years ago or so, but it is right now.
But that's just the cultural milieu from which you're coming. I'm interested that when I use the word hostility, you use the word skepticism, because I've personally been frankly astonished during this war about the automatic tendency to disbelieve anything Israel says and automatically believe anything Hamas says. And sometimes the contrast within a single paragraph is striking. I saw in the New York Times just this week, in an otherwise very positive report for Israel about how Hamas is fighting in Gaza. And the report highlighted that Hamas has dug tunnels under a major UN compound and Gaza's biggest hospital, and echoing things that, as a government spokesman, I was saying at the start of the war and was almost made out to sound like a madman for pointing out how Hamas was putting itself under civilian facilities. And the New York Times wrote this extraordinary sentence. It says, Israel says that it has killed more than 14,000 of Hamas's 25,000 fighters, an unverifiable and disputed number. The next paragraph says, more than 38,000 Palestinians have died in the conflict, according to the Gazan Health Ministry, which is, of course, Hamas. And yet I've never seen them frame...
Wait, they wrote, which is, of course,
No,
Hamas?
I'm saying, which is, of course, Hamas. The New York Times didn't say that. Right. That's why I'm adding the clarification.
Yeah.
And yet they will never write that the Gaza Health Ministry, which is, of course, Hamas figure, is unverifiable and disputed. So try to help me understand what is happening in the newsroom where they feel a need to put this caveat on the Israeli figure, but not on the Palestinian figure, given that we know that that 38,000 includes incomplete records where they have no ID numbers, double-counted bodies, people who were reported on Google Forms, the 500 people they claimed were killed in the Al-Ahli hospital strike, which was in fact a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. Well, why is that not unverifiable and disputed? What's happening there?
So first of all, I do think there are some journalists who are actively hostile to Israel. I mean, you look at Al Jazeera, you look at the whole gray zone, Jewish currents, all these far left, there are journalists who are hostile to Israel openly. And then there's the journalists who are more in the mainstream media, some of them could be hostile to Israel. Personally, I don't think their outlets are hostile to Israel per se, but they have this, it's like a journalistic worldview is when you see someone who has power, you want to inspect that and you want to question it. You don't want to just accept it.
Which is absolutely the role of journalists and what they should be doing.
Right. And I think that people have this skewed view of what's going on here where they see Israel is powerful, Palestinians are weak, and therefore we have to scrutinize Israel a lot more because they have more power.
Is
and
that frame
as
wrong?
an Israeli, it is just a lot more, it's just incredibly lacking in nuance, right? Like, is the Israeli army more powerful than Hamas? Sure.
And thank God.
Thank God. Is the Israeli army incredibly shackled in its power by the norms of rules of war and humanitarian law, et cetera, in a way that Hamas is not? Yes. And the other thing is,
You want to hear a joke? Hamas says that it's committed to international and humanitarian law.
Yeah.
Would be funny if it weren't so sad, right?
Right. Exactly. But like, it's also like, are the children of Sderot more powerful than Hamas that they get, targeted with rockets all the time? Are the families who have to be evacuated from the north because Hezbollah is shooting missiles at them more powerful than Hezbollah? And so I just think that the black and white way that this is being described is a problem, and that journalists need to understand context and they need to describe things in a much more nuanced way that many fail to do.
But help me understand why, when a journalist writes an article, an editor would find a need to put a health warning on those numbers, despite the AP saying that Hamas's daily figures are simply inconsistent with the overall casualty numbers. They've then gone back to using Hamas's casualty figures despite saying that they're not reliable. Yeah. Why would an editor find a need to say that the Israeli number is unverifiable and disputed, but not attach that same label to the Palestinian numbers, given that one is simply demonstrably false methodologically?
Sometimes in news, if you make a mistake in an article, and then you're writing a new article, you might go back and look at the article about the same topic to just get your information instead of doing research from, the ground up. And so mistakes get recycled in news, unfortunately. Or just certain terms, like I remember when I worked at the Jerusalem Post, almost every article described Gaza as a coastal enclave. I don't know how we came up with that phrase, but it just happens again and again. So I that's sort of like a technical reason. But what you want to know is like a deeper reason. And I just think that they're just wrong. They're lacking nuance. And I think it has to do with the general media bias question of, whether it's a cultural milieu, whether they feel sort of more comfortable being critical of Israel than a journalist based in Gaza can be criticizing Hamas, because then they might be, dragged through the streets off of a truck or something, which are something that has happened, although I don't think it goes to a journalist. But so there's all of these reasons that sort of come together and make them biased against Israel.
Look, media hostility, skepticism, for all the reasons that you have described, definitely a reason that Israel seems to be losing the information war. And let's put this on the table. Israel is losing the information war. And I'm wondering why you think that is. Is it because of an implacably hostile media? Is it because, as I've been arguing, Israel has basically given up on the fight of the information war? 10 months into the war, why do you think that Israel is losing the information war, if indeed it is?
So there are, again, so many questions, but I think that a big part of it is that the other side speaks in one voice a lot more than we do. And it's for bad reasons, right? Israel is a democratic society. We are varied, we are diverse, and we have a lot of different views on things, even though there's relative, or for most of the war, there's been relative unity about what we think about this war in Israel.
Right, but 2 Jews, 3 opinions. 2 Israeli Jews, it's 5 opinions.
Right, exactly. And I wouldn't want to change that, because I think that that's part of the beauty of, first of all, the Jewish people, and second of all, Israeli society.
It's our strength.
But it's not our strength when you're fighting an information war, right? You can't fight a war with an army that has 5 different chiefs of staff, So if you think about that in terms of information, we're all like, everyone's freelancing. And the Palestinians are incredibly organized. I mean, I've seen documents that were sent out to Students for Justice for Palestine across the United States on October 7th already, where they basically had the playbook for the encampments. The encampments only started later, but they
call them the tentifada here.
The tentifada, yes.
We keep on message.
They had all of the messaging. They had the idea of, sort of taking over areas of campuses. They were ready for this. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't have any way of knowing if Students for Justice in Palestine knew about October 7th, if someone high up there or whatever. That's not what I'm saying.
I think if they knew, they would have participated themselves.
They were ready for something. And Israel should have been ready because it's not our first rodeo. I mean, it's our worst rodeo, but not our first. And we weren't.
And so how do we remedy that?
First of all, I think they need to be a lot more prepared. And unfortunately, I think they're failing at that because by basically disbanding the operation that it was like, I mean, of course, because you're a part of it, it was an ad hoc operation, right? But it was working. And then they basically disbanded it. And if they don't have an operation that continues, then how will they be prepared next time there's a crisis? I think the Prime Minister's office, which is supposed to run sort of the government messaging, right? Those offices are under the auspices of the Prime Minister's office. They don't take it seriously enough. They don't hire enough people. Look, Netanyahu, when Hamas attacked on October 7th, it was less than a year into Netanyahu's newest term, and he really had not made a lot of hires. It wasn't only in the media space where he had not hired an English language spokesperson, for example. But he should have known that this is an important thing, that he does need to hire someone in this space. And not only that one job of English language spokesperson, but to have an entire system backing that person up, which he didn't have and was all thrown together haphazardly after October 7th.
I wonder whether you think part of the reason that Israel is struggling in the information war, and here I want to pick your brains as former Knesset reporter who looks at the political dynamics in Israel, is that sometimes there is a clash between politicians' domestic interests and the message they want the public here to hear, and the international message. And at a time that Israel needs to be speaking about how it is flooding Gaza with aid and going out of its way to open new avenues for aid to be delivered by air, land, and sea, and that more food is entering Gaza now compared with before the war, and that we're operating crossings even as we are being shot at, and despite the fact that we lost 4 soldiers in an attack on Kerem Shalom, we continue to do everything possible to deliver aid to the people of Gaza. I mean, that's a message that is important internationally, but doesn't land well on Israeli ears at all. And the Prime Minister then has to say, look, the reason that we have to let in humanitarian aid is because it will give us the legitimacy that we need to continue this war, even though many people will be skeptical about our responsibilities to flood that place with aid, given that that is a territory that was used to attack us on October 7th and is still controlled by a terror regime that we are telling the global media is hijacking and hoarding that aid. And so a lot of the messaging about humanitarian aid, for example, is coming from Kogat, the military unit responsible, which has a great social media presence, not so much in the international media in terms of responding to journalists' queries, definitely not TV hits and giving interviews. But some of those critical messages we're not hearing from the top levels of government because maybe their domestic interests give them an interest to keep things quiet. I'm just wondering how you unpack that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that dynamic happens again and again and again. The humanitarian aid is a very apt example. I mean, the United States and now Canada have sanctioned, and the EU as well, have sanctioned people who are involved in trying to block trucks of aid getting into Gaza. First of all, how much damage have these people actually done, right? It's a futile protest, right? It's, 50 people against enormous trucks. So even if you think that these people are despicable, the fact that they are taking the time out of whatever, Biden's busy presidential schedule to do that, I find that pathetic and inappropriately hostile to Israel. Putting that aside, my thoughts about the policy view there, they don't seem to understand the context in Israel, right? In Israel, Israelis view this as the humanitarian aid to Gaza is at best a necessary evil because everyone in Israel knows that the aid is propping up Hamas. If the people in Gaza were in...
And by the way, so does President Biden, because at the beginning of the war, He said, humanitarian aid must flow into Gaza. If Hamas is hijacking it, then that will, of course, end. And then very quickly backtracked when they realized that Hamas was hijacking it and you didn't want to leave civilians in a vulnerable position of not having food because Hamas is stealing it. And that's why Israel's been pumping more and more into there.
Right. So you have people in Israel who say, you know, my husband, son, brother is risking his life fighting in Gaza. And that, you know, and so Israel is sort of like with its right hand fighting Hamas and then with its left hand helping Hamas by bringing this aid that helps them survive another day. And some of those people are also relatives of hostages, by the way. So there's also people who are saying, like, why are we feeding our, you know, the people who are taking our family hostage? And yet that people don't seem to understand that message internationally. They don't seem to understand the Israeli context of the way that Israel views things. And so when we're talking about the humanitarian aid and who's talking about the humanitarian aid, like people need to understand that in Israel, it's not viewed as like, oh, look how generous and wonderful we are. It's like, we're such suckers, you know? And I think like enough people understand that like, this is what you need for international legitimacy, but there is a vocal minority and maybe not even such a small minority who says, well, why are we doing this? Like, they don't like us anyway, you know? So why should we be trying to please them? So it becomes a very difficult dynamic. And in the coalition itself, right, there are at least two party leaders, right, with Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who I think oppose this as well, although they haven't threatened to leave the government over this specifically.
Sometimes Israel doesn't seem to be doing itself any favors in the information war, but we can't get away from the fact that the media landscape is often very difficult to deal with. Going back to this point we made earlier about the automatic tendency to believe anything Hamas said and disbelieve anything Israel said. And I think the first major example we had of this during the war, and this refutes the narrative that the whole world was with us and on our side at the beginning, came barely 10 days into the war with the Al-Ahli hospital incident, when Hamas put out a press release saying that an Israeli airstrike had flattened a hospital and killed 500 people. And when the sun came up in the morning, it was clear that it was Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired, landed in the car park, and killed perhaps dozens of people. And yet by the time that Israel had put its story out there, the media had already been pumping that, according to Palestinian health officials, the same ones who burned children alive on October 7th, there had been an Israeli airstrike on a hospital, and then they found themselves trying to do damage control for themselves by saying, well, it's an open question rather than admitting they were wrong. And we have a clip here from Alistair Bunkle from Sky News speaking the following morning as evidence was beginning to come to light that, in fact, this was not an Israeli airstrike after all. Let's watch it together.
People will make up their minds. People will have already made up their minds, particularly in the Arab world. And I think whatever the Israelis have to say and however much detailed intelligence they release to prove their position, frankly, there will be a lot in the Arab world who just simply do not believe it. What the Israelis say is one thing. The reality on the ground, I'm afraid, is very different.
People will, of course, made up their minds because perfectly respectable organizations like Sky News and CNN amplified the Hamas message before checking the facts. And that's quite an astonishing statement at the end to say, well, what the Israelis say is one thing, reality on the ground, people have made up their minds. And I'm wondering...
You know what's really astonishing is it said on that screen, Tel Aviv. He doesn't know the reality on the ground.
Because he's not located in Gaza.
Right.
Right. And so you find this recurring dynamic so often where Hamas is gaming the international media. Hamas is gaming the international media because it knows that there is this tendency to believe anything it says, disbelieve anything Israel says, and uses that to its benefit. Whether it's the allegations of the mass rapes or the mass graves at Shifa Hospital, or the allegation that Israel opened fire at people waiting to receive flour and receive aid. It puts out these trial balloons, knowing that the media will take it, and they keep falling for it. And so I'm wondering if you as a journalist have just gone on TV and said, we believe that an Israeli airstrike flattened a hospital. And it turned out it's not true because it wasn't an Israeli airstrike and a hospital wasn't flattened. Why are you then not then skeptical about the source that gave you that information and saying, you know, fool me once, shame on you, okay? Why do they keep falling into Hamas's trap?
Look, Personally, if somebody lies to me and I found out they lied to me, then I know. I make a mental note and I know, but sometimes you have no choice, right? Because that's the only person to talk to on a certain topic. And then you need to make a mental note and you need to be skeptical and you need to write like these sources, these numbers are unverified, as the New York Times only seems to say about Israel. And so, there, in my view, it's like journalistic malpractice. I mean, Hamas lies like they breathe. And yet journalists don't do anything about it. And I remember—
Why?
There's two things. Number one, they have no other source of information in Gaza. The journalists who are in Gaza are, at this point, and for most of this war, are Palestinians who are afraid of Hamas. They can't really say anything strong against Hamas or their lives are in danger. But
that's in the best case if they're not actively
Correct.
supportive of Hamas, or indeed Hamas content creators, because we find on the list of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, talking about all the journalists who've been killed in Gaza, people who are listed as working for Hamas-affiliated Al-Aqsa TV. And you say, wait a minute, how are you working for a terrorist?
As first reported by me in Jewish
In
Insider.
Jewish Insider,
yes.
Of course. How's that for mansplaining? I'm quoting your own reporting back to you as evidence that I've done my research. These are Hamas content creators. They're working both for a Hamas. You see, this is how effective your reporting is, that it's become part of common knowledge without my even remembering where I learned it from.
No, but it's true. I mean, you read the Committee for Protection of Journalists list, and it's in their list, like some of these places that they write that they're Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah media. It says it right there. And I asked the Committee for Protection of Journalists and also the Journalism Without Borders, or Reporters Without Borders is what they're called. And they basically said, well, they're still journalists and they were still killed while doing their jobs, which also I have questioned, which I think is questionable. But they said they're journalists killed while doing their jobs, so that's who we count. But I mean, what kind of journalist are you? You're a spokesperson for a terrorist organization.
Right. I noticed they haven't, at the last time I checked, included in that list the journalist who held the three hostages who held the hostages in his home in Gaza. Haven't quite taken credit for that one. But I come back to this question. There is a terrorist organization that on October 7th burned whole families alive and abducted children and grandmothers. It then lied and said that it hadn't abducted children and grandmothers, even as it was releasing them. Why do journalists not say this jihadi death cult is clearly an unreliable source, and next time they give us information, we will say, let's park that to one side, we will do our fact-checking before reporting this jihadi death cult as health officials?
Look, it's all of these things that add up. There's time pressures, for example. They work very fast. But I don't really think that answers the question why. Because you having to go really fast and not being able to verify every number doesn't mean that you can't write for Hamas also that the numbers are unverified, right? So there just is not one answer, right? And I think that, unfortunately, there's just an intense amount of bias where they put Israel at fault first. And it's because of power dynamics, and it's because of sort of the cultural milieu, and it's because of just copying things that they saw someone else wrote in their same newspaper last week. And it all adds up to something that's not great.
The media have been relying on another unreliable source, apart from the Hamas army of terror. UNRWA, the UN agency that is a Hamas front, that Hamas uses to launder its information by putting a UN stamp on it, that has been covering up how Hamas has militarized its schools and UN facilities and dug tunnels underneath them, that keeps getting quoted as a reliable source. I'll tell you an astonishing moment I had at the beginning of the war. UNRWA tweeted that people purporting to represent the Ministry of Health, Hamas, came and stole fuel and medical supplies from one of its compounds.
Right.
They then deleted that tweet and put out another tweet saying that they denied reports on social media. What reports on social media? Their own tweet. I then went up for an interview on BBC Radio a couple of days after, and they told me we just had an UNRWA spokesperson who assured us that Hamas cannot steal fuel from their compounds. I said, what are you talking about? They admitted it. And then they backtracked it in a retraction that sounded like someone was holding a gun to their social media person's head. I'm wondering, why does UNRWA continue to be quoted as a reliable source, given the incontrovertible evidence that it has been covering up Hamas's militarization of its own facilities and is an integral part of not only Hamas's information war, its military machine, its military apparatus in Gaza?
I think there's like credential bias that's backed up by a conspiracy of silence. Journalists want to look for someone who's an expert, who has credentials and isn't just some guy, right? And so UNRWA, they're the UN Refugee Agency. They run schools in Gaza.
Well, the UN Refugee Agency is something else.
For Palestinians.
And then, okay, their own bespoke refugee agency.
Correct. So that sounds like good credentials, right? If you don't know a lot. If you actually know what's going on, you know they're problematic. But you have governments all over the world who are still propping them up despite all of this, right? So, that grants them even further legitimacy.
Which is astonishing, because part of what we've been trying to say through the Citizen Spokesperson's Office is that international funding for UNRWA is a direct subsidy to the Hamas army of terror when it is taking over UN facilities and then has the head of those UN facilities going to the United Nations and schnorring for more money from international taxpayers. They are paying into an essential part of Hamas's military infrastructure, but they don't get it.
And I just think that UNRWA, look, the UN, in my opinion, in general, is an institution that's completely taken over by, dictators and Islamo-fascists around the world who have way too much power and influence on
because out of the nearly 200 countries in the world, what, 80 are democracies, 80 to 90?
And then how many of its, institutions, not only UNRWA, you have the UN Human Rights Council, UN Women, right, are dominated by people who don't actually come from societies with developed human rights or are democracies. You can come from, a tyrannical, state and be a great Democrat and human rights advocate.
Yes, but not if you're nominated by that state.
Exactly.
I keep getting back to this question about why the media doesn't learn its lessons and understand that Hamas is gaming it. Because you said for you, it's so obvious that a source lies to you, you don't take it seriously. We had this recurring story at the beginning of the war about how Gaza was just about to run out of fuel in a few hours. Let's have a look here at one of the headlines that came out in the early stages of the war. Hamas puts out a press release and you get headlines, Gaza's hospitals will run out of fuel in just a few hours, UN warns. And something astonishing happens. They don't run out of fuel. I remember giving a press conference in which we spoke about how Hamas had 400,000 liters of fuel stockpiled and ready for this war. And I wanted to explain how much fuel that was. I did a back of the envelope calculation and showed you could circumnavigate the globe in a Boeing 747 with the amount of fuel that Gaza's government, Hamas, had stockpiled. And the hospitals didn't run out of fuel. And they didn't run out of fuel because Hamas kept drip feeding fuel into the hospitals to keep them operational, because it needed to keep those human shields above ground to shield its operations underground. And it was like a Hanukkah miracle because they didn't run out of fuel. And so we end up, let's have a look at the next comparison we have here.
There was, instead of 8 days, it's been 8 months.
Well, since Israel has backtracked and decided to allow fuel in under international pressure. A headline from the 15th of October, fuel reserves at Gaza hospitals likely to run out in 24 hours. The UN is warning. And then the next headline is from 19 days later. Gaza faces communications blackout due to lack of fuel. And I'm tearing my hair out trying to explain to journalists the same source that is telling you that Gaza is about to have a communications blackout because it's going to run out of fuel was telling you 3 weeks ago that there wasn't enough fuel to keep the hospitals running for more than another few hours, and you got duped. It's worse than that. If you go to the website of the dashboard that shows the humanitarian update in Gaza, it will tell you that Gaza has 0 hours of electricity. But that's patently untrue because there is electricity that's coming from either solar resources. Look at all the tweets. Look at all the media that the Hamas content creators are feeding people around the world. And I get back to this question. If you are a newspaper editor and you go, I guess that headline we posted 3 weeks ago was completely false and we got duped. Why do you fall for it again?
At this point, I feel like the question is rhetorical because, like, none of my answers really answer the question.
They're getting duped. They're getting duped by this.
And it's at a certain point you feel like they don't want to know. They don't want to know because they have a narrative that they've built up in their head and they're just looking to support it. And that kind of confirmation bias is, just a real virus in journalism. I mean, it just goes against what journalism is supposed to be about.
And then people want to know, how do you combat this? If the problem with the international media landscape is that they've decided on a narrative and will simply use whatever facts or pseudo-facts support that narrative, then how does one fight an information war if information doesn't matter? Is there any point to putting out facts, to putting out statistics, to setting the record straight, if it doesn't matter because some flunky with UN on their business card will always trump me, no matter how many facts I have on my side? The facts matter.
I think the facts do matter. I think that Israel needs to continue to stand up for truth. And I think that we need to do it more, right? And more professionally. And in the end of the day, hopefully there will be some number of people who will tell the real story, right? And will reflect the reality on the ground for real and not what Sky News seems to think it is.
One of the stories that has been doing the rounds, and this is actually connected to your reporting as well, claims that Netanyahu wanted to pump money into Hamas to try to prop it up as part of some strategy to keep the Palestinians divided. Now, he'd explained in the past that the PA had been transferring millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza, was arguing, according to this reporting, that it was better for Israel to try to control that pipeline to make sure that it didn't go to terrorism. But I keep getting quoted back at me that Netanyahu was somehow trying to prop up the Hamas terror regime because he wanted Hamas to govern Gaza. I'm wondering, where did this story come from?
Okay, so Qatar started sending money to Hamas in Gaza in 2012, I believe, but it started to get more intense after the 2014 war. Now, we have to remember, first of all, 2014, Israel fought a war over a month. I believe it was like around 50 days in Gaza. And it ended essentially not because Israel was done and they won and they felt they'd eradicated Gaza. I mean, they destroyed a few tunnels and didn't know how many were left, but there was intense pressure from the US to end. So Israel just sort of cut it at a certain point, not really when there was a specific victory, a specific achievement. After that, the whole world sort of swoops in as like, we're going to try to rebuild Gaza. We need plans to rebuild Gaza. And they wanted to send in a lot of money. And Israel, these are governments with which Israel has good relations, not only the US, it's also the EU. And so Israel sort of, set limitations. We can't let in things that are going to be used for terrorism. But they were like, fine, we're going to let our allies and friendly countries send in. And people are vouching for Qatar. They want to help Hamas. And there was this idea in Israel, which has been around for decades, of economic peace. Now, not necessarily that there's going to be peace with Gaza, but just that the higher your standard of living is, the more you have to lose, and the less likely you are to want to, be a suicide bomber or start a war against Israel. And this is something that I think people believe across the board. I think Netanyahu also believed it. I don't think Netanyahu thought that it was a solution, but I think that Netanyahu thought it was a way to bring quiet. And his sort of slogan was quiet will be answered with quiet, right? So it wasn't like Netanyahu thought there was going to be peace.
Right.
Right. But he said, if you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. And he thought that the way to do that was to allow money to come into Gaza to allow people to have a normal standard of living, which they
buy
did.
them off.
Essentially to buy them off, right. Now, the other thing is, in 2019, and I'll just sort of give the backstory here, which is in the Knesset, the Likud had a meeting every Monday, and when the meeting would end, I would call different Knesset members and ask them to tell me what happened in the meeting. And I was talking to one of the Knesset members I spoke to. You mean
you weren't waiting for the press release to come out with the official version?
Exactly. So, and the Knesset member said to me, we were pushing Netanyahu. We were saying, why are you sending money into Gaza? This was a time when there were incendiary balloons coming in that were burning fields near the Gaza border. So why are you still letting...
Eco-terrorism.
Right.
I don't recall Greta Thunberg saying anything about it back then.
Of course not. And they were saying, why are we still letting aid money go into Gaza when they're burning down all of our agricultural fields? And Netanyahu, again, speaking to a right-wing Likudnik audience, he said, you should want Hamas to get this money because if Hamas is in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority is in Ramallah and they're divided, then there'll be less pressure on us to negotiate for a Palestinian state. Now, that's not the reason Netanyahu's letting money into Gaza. That was him making a political argument in the Likud faction meeting.
And the real reason that he was letting money in was, for the record,
international pressure to try to keep quiet in Gaza, basically. A combination of both, right? One is if he didn't do it, he would have the Americans and the Europeans on his back all day. Number two, I think he believed that he was buying time and
why do you
quiet.
And why do you think then the explanation he gave to the Likud caucus that this was a way to keep the Palestinians divided so that Israel wouldn't be pressured into negotiations for a two-state reality, why do you think that's the insincere explanation?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that also I confirmed this with someone else because I wasn't in the room, so I didn't only
Because you're a good journalist. You check your sources.
So I just want people to think I didn't just hear this from
You're not Sky News.
The reason that I think that it's not the sincere explanation is because if Netanyahu were to say to them, first of all, he said all the time, basically, that this is, quiet will be answered by quiet, is how he says it in Hebrew, right? He basically was saying, like, this is how we keep them off our back. But in that moment, Israelis didn't feel like things were quiet. To the international media, balloons filled with fire that burned down fields is still peace, and it's not justified for Israel to strike back at Gaza, right? But for Israelis, that's a really big threat. These fires were lapping on the edges of people's homes. It wasn't like nothing, and there have been others, all kinds of forest fires in Israel that have also been, by the way, arson by people who do not wish Israel well. So for him to make the argument, I was buying quiet on that day would not have worked, right? But the root of this funding, where it came from, right? Because it didn't just start on that day in 2019, was to try to buy time and calm and quiet from Gaza.
And we didn't get that quiet in Gaza, and now we're in a war. And as part of that war, we'll all agree that freedom of the press is an absolute bedrock of any democratic society. And yet recently Israel took the unusual measure of banning Al Jazeera. Why did it do that? And do you think it was wise?
So, first of all, Israel did it because they felt that Al Jazeera was doing things that were dangerous to its war effort. Not just dangerous in terms of like propaganda that's harmful to Israel, because Al Jazeera has been doing that since its inception, but that they were revealing sort of troop movements, which violate every foreign journalist who comes into Israel has to register and they sign a document. And one of the things that they say they won't do is give away troop movements. Now, there are all kinds of things that foreign journalists in Israel do that violate that document, and it's not something that's like strongly enforced. For example, there's a military censor in Israel that says like, what are military secrets that you're not allowed to write? So the journalist who's based in Israel doesn't write it. He just calls his colleague in New York, and that colleague writes it. Like it's not like anyone thinks that piece of paper is so legally binding. But Al Jazeera was repeatedly doing things that were putting troops in direct danger. They had a camera set up in Israel facing Gaza where you could see the troop movements, and that camera was taken down. It was in Sderot, in the city of Sderot on the Gaza border.
By the way, that camera saved us with the Al Ahli hospital incident, because it was that camera that when Islamic Jihad fired rockets at Israel, picked up one of them misfiring and landing back down. So they did us a favor on that occasion.
So you never know, right? But the government sort of felt that this is a problem.
So it wasn't because they felt that Al Jazeera's coverage was hostile. And I mean, when they run across the screen, genocide in Gaza, this is not objective journalism, this is activism.
There's the official reason and the politics. The military is the official reason, and the sort of legally justifiable reason that the attorney general would okay. What the politicians talk about, they talk about that Al Jazeera is anti-Israel propaganda. They're not wrong. I think it is anti-Israel propaganda. But like I said, like there's been anti-Israel propaganda on Al Jazeera for decades. The reason that this was, Israel as a society is a country of laws, and the reason that this was legally permissible for the government to do was because of the, putting IDF soldiers in danger. As a journalist, what do I think of it? I have mixed feelings. I think you need really strong evidence that they were putting people's lives in danger in order to take action. And when that's the case, then I do think it's justified. I think if you're taking it off the air because it's anti-Israel propaganda, they can still do that. You know, like it's
right.
It's
We
not
haven't
really
shut
gonna
down.
work.
We haven't shut down Al Jazeera. It's still operating and broadcasting around the world.
And I just think that censorship is not the response to speech that you don't like. I don't think that helps ultimately.
Another concern that many of your colleagues have, and we have a letter here from the Foreign Press Association, the fact that Israel isn't allowing international media into Gaza.
Yeah.
They will often talk about their reporters on the ground. Their reporters on the ground are local Palestinian journalists who, in the best case, are cowed and intimidated by Hamas. In the worst case, openly sympathetic with it, like most of Gaza's population, according to Palestinian polls of Palestinians, or actively Hamas content creators. But the reality is that journalists are getting their information from Palestinian fixers on the ground who have never produced a single image, a single headline, anything that is critical of or inconvenient to Hamas. The international media are playing this game of saying, on the one hand, we completely trust the information from our journalists on the ground. On the other hand, apparently not enough, because we still want to get our own international journalists on the ground. And I think you have to make your mind up. Is your coverage good enough? Or is it not good enough? But anyway, this letter here demanding access for the foreign press to Gaza, expressing its shock and profound disappointment that 9 months into a devastating war, Israel continues to bar independent access for the international media from Gaza. Never before has Israel enforced such a long and strict information blackout. Apparently not an information blackout because they claim that they have reporters on the ground who are getting information out there, but park that to one side. It has repeatedly rejected our appeals for access, fought us in court to uphold this draconian ban, and offered a handful of highly controlled embed opportunities for a small number of our members. And the Supreme Court has, in fact, backed the government's decision not to let the international media into Gaza, saying that they could expose troop movements and this would be a threat to national security. But I wonder sometimes if they are relying on local Palestinian journalists who are not independent. And let's be honest, even if the global media go into Gaza, they don't have free access because either they are operating in areas where the IDF controls, or they're in areas controlled by Hamas and they have to toe the line or else, okay? That's a nice news outlet you have there. Would be a shame if anything happened to it. Is Israel paying a price by not letting the international media into Gaza, since it means that the only information is coming from Palestinian journalists who, for all the criticism we may have of Sky or BBC's teams in Israel, the level of bias from Palestinian journalists is obviously off the charts.
Yeah, I do think that Israel should be letting more journalists into Gaza. I think,
unrestricted?
No, I don't think it should be a free-for-all. In the first month, there were like thousands of foreign journalists who came into Israel. You might know the exact number. I don't remember. But they should be letting a lot more. And they should be letting them, the sign a waiver so that you don't blame Israel or whatever if you're injured or worse, God forbid. But they should be letting people just go to Gaza if that's what they want. Enter through Egypt or whatever it is. But they should let more journalists in. Is
Israel shooting itself in the foot by not letting in international journalists?
I understand. I think that they're worried that if journalists are severely injured or killed while they're reporting in Gaza, and those journalists are not Palestinians, the international outrage is going to be even greater than it's been about Palestinians, I think. And I think that has a lot to do with it, that Israel knows they can't really protect journalists. Certainly,
because even taking them on embed operations, I've heard some spine-chilling stories from journalists who are taken in with the IDF and are talking about how bullets are whizzing overhead. I mean, there is no way to protect journalists in a war zone.
Right. So I think the journalists have to accept that risk, right? I'm not a war reporter, right? But there are people who do that. There are people who, went and covered the war on ISIS and followed, the Kurds. And I have a colleague who did that, followed the Kurds, and it's very dangerous. And you don't have a Western-style government who's very organized and checking where every journalist is going. So it is very dangerous. But I do think that Israel's somewhat shooting itself in the foot. And I think back to 2014, where I actually interviewed a lot of Western journalists who were, or not only Western, but international journalists who were leaving Gaza. And a lot of them talked about seeing, you know, the Al-Ali hospital being used, not the Al-Ali, Shifa hospital, being used as sort of Hamas headquarters, and seeing rockets being shot from civilian, you know, just regular residential neighborhoods. I interviewed a journalist who, and you can't find it, it's scrubbed from the internet, but I'll tell you why soon. I interviewed a journalist from Vice News who had been in Gaza, and he came out and he told me that Gaza was constantly threatening the international journalists. You can't write this, you can't film this, you can't talk about this, otherwise we're, you know, going to do something to you. It was scrubbed because he went to cover the war on ISIS, and people there found this interview with him, and he felt it was putting him in danger. So we agreed to scrub it because we didn't want to be the ones putting him in danger. But it was on the internet for a few years there.
Because, you know, the FPA will be demanding free and unfettered access to Gaza when there is no such thing as free and unfettered access.
Correct.
In a war zone that will be controlled by a terrorist group that we know from past experience does not allow journalists to set up a camera showing how a rocket is being fired from inside a civilian area,
Correct.
Putting civilians in danger. And in the meanwhile, the international media are relying on information from nice chaps like Abdallah al-Jamal, whose name might ring a bell because he was the contributor for the Palestine Chronicle from the Gaza Strip, who was in fact holding hostages in his home just before the daring rescue mission that rescued Noah Argamani and the 3 other hostages. We have here some of the reports that he had published. Abdallah al-Jamal, a contributor for the Palestine Chronicle, seen as a source of information. And one of the last articles he published before Israeli soldiers burst into his house was "My house will always be open." Stories from the Gaza siege. And he was actually holding hostages in his spare room as he sat in the kitchen typing that story, "My house will always be open." And I'm wondering...
For a nonprofit registered in the United States.
And Almog Meir Jan, who was held as a hostage in his house, is now suing the Palestine Chronicle because it's registered as a nonprofit in the United States. And I'm wondering, when you speak to colleagues who are in the international media, why are they not more skeptical about their colleagues inside Gaza, knowing that many of them end up being people like this, who are in fact completely in league with Hamas? Do they take the information coming out of Gaza with 2 pinches of salt? And if not, why?
I can't say that I've had an actual conversation like this with anyone, but I would say that most of these people, at the very least, know how Israelis view this, and therefore they should take it into consideration. It's got to be somewhere in the back of their heads, but they're working with a team. They're working with editors who are looking at things too. And again, I find that the foreign press, when you have people who are parachuted in here or people who live here for a couple of years and then leave, I'm not talking about like Israelis who have a life here, but then also work for, you know, the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg or whoever. But the people who just come here, right? I find that they're, you know, they have their view on Israel and they're like, you know, this is the way things are.
Okay, well, look, to round us off, I want to play a game with you. We are going to look at some of the media around the world, and I want to get your sense of where we put them on a report card, okay? It is important that our viewers know how to consume media responsibly, know which media outlets have been doing the hard journalistic work of double-checking their sources, and which have been a little bit more economical with the truth. So let's play our game right now that we are calling Newsworthy or Not. We're going to go through several international media outlets, and I want to get your sense of whether these are reliable outlets. And if you have any anecdotes about particular stories that were good or bad, let's teach people how to consume media responsibly. Our first contestant today is the New York Times. How do we rank the New York Times?
The New York Times is a really hard one because of these grades, right? I think the New York Times does a lot of really high quality reporting, and they do a lot of in-depth reporting about Israel. And so it's really hard for me to give them an across the board grade. At the same time, they do things like that article that you quoted, where they're just completely skeptical and untrusting of Israel. And are credulous of Hamas. Right. So they're a very mixed bag. So I guess I'll make them average.
Average reporting. But it varies. I mean, there is some absolutely
Correct.
high quality reporting coming out of Patrick's bureau in the New York Times. Let's see our next contestant. Fox News, represented on the ground by its own resident action man, Trey Yingst.
So normally I don't name names, but since we named Trey Yingst, he is like one of the best people doing TV reporting about Israel. He is really just quality stuff.
Why is that?
I just find him to, first of all, be really understanding and trying to get both sides of the story. And maybe it comes from being a little bit of an underdog, right? Like Fox I think Fox is #1 in ratings in cable news in America, but in terms of like in the journalism milieu, right? Like people sort of like turn up their noses at Fox. So maybe they work a little harder because they're the underdogs. I think, what is that? There's a rental car company. I think it's Hertz. That's there. We're #2. Anyway, so we work harder. So maybe that's where it comes from. But Trey, I think, works really hard, gets really good stories, tries to bring both sides. Not everything he says is going to be totally comfortable to Israelis. It's not the cliche of Fox News. He does really, really good work. Their website, on the other hand, is a lot of just like aggregating, pulling a bunch of things together. But if we're talking about TV, the reporting on Israel is high quality.
It helps when you have absolutely no fear and will put yourself in the line of danger to get the best stories out like Trey does.
Yeah, I mean, I have even war reporters who report things I really don't like. I have a lot of respect for their courage.
Okay, let's have a look. So wait, how are we ranking Fox?
I'm going to go with high quality.
High quality reporting
Israel,
from Fox News. Our next contestant is CNN. What do we make of CNN?
They have some good reporters on the ground, but I think that they come from a really deep place of bias. Back in the days when people still used bumper stickers instead of tweets to express their reputation, there's a very common, like in the Second Intifada, a very common bumper sticker in Israel that said CNN lies. There's a reason Israelis are hostile to CNN. I just think CNN, with the exception of like one or two like hosts of shows, but we're talking about reporting, is not good.
Why is that? Because I was actually pleasantly surprised. Maybe it's because I was used to dealing with the British media that were openly hostile and sneering, that their anchors from Jake to Wolf to Dana
It's not the anchors, but they're war reporters. There's a specific person I have in mind, but again, I'm not going to name names about negative things. That are maybe not American and come a little bit more from the sneering British sort of tradition. And I don't feel like when I'm in press conferences and the questions they ask, I don't feel like they come from a place of like openness to try to hear things. That's often, by the way, this is true of Israeli journalists too. When I feel like the question that someone's asking is in of itself a judgment of the person you're asking, I feel like you're not doing a good job as a journalist because you're not really open to hearing the answer.
And if people want an example of CNN's reporting, I'll refer them back to an episode we did with your former boss, Yaakov Katz. You worked together at the Jerusalem Post, where CNN had a story about how more than half of Israel's munitions dropped on Gaza were so-called dumb bombs, and then hidden in unguided munitions. And then in paragraph 12, they said, but experts believe that Israel is using them in combination with the techniques that makes them just as precise weapons. But then the headline is giving the viewers the opposite impression. But as a government spokesman, at least, I felt that the anchors were always very open and friendly and polite and inquisitive. So how are we ranking CNN?
The people that you named, those anchors, Jake Tapper has done so much, as much as anybody to raise awareness of the hostage issue in the U.S.
100%.
So that's why I'm sort of separating the anchors from the reporters on the ground.
Interesting. So how do we rank CNN?
Well, I guess if I have to again, average them out, I'll put them at average.
Put them at average. Okay. And our next contestant is, drumroll, the BBC. Lahav, what do we make of the BBC?
They get a very bad grade.
Why?
Can I tell you, I used to get phone calls from BBC Arabic asking me to talk about things that are going on in Israel.
Do you speak Arabic?
I don't. They would translate me. The WhatsApp picture of the person who had asked me to come on the air was a picture of Arafat writing on a chalkboard in Arabic. I asked a colleague who speaks Arabic what it says, and it said, Jerusalem is Palestinian. And I said to the BBC, I said, it's just disrespectful. Like, if you're going to ask me to come do unpaid labor for you, and you're going to insult me like that by having someone whose life mission was to kill people like me in the picture when you ask me that question. So, and I think that the quality of their journalism about Israel is reflected through the kinds of people they're apparently hiring.
Any particular headlines or reporting during this war that you would flag up for our report card?
I think you follow BBC a lot closer than me, but the interview...
I'll say something that interviewers tell me.
Yeah.
I'm asking questions here.
Well, you mentioned Yaakov Katz. So Yaakov Katz recently did an interview with the BBC where they accused Israel, based on Human Rights Watch, which we Israelis already know is not a reliable source, that Israel's using white phosphorus in Lebanon, which I didn't know Human Rights Watch just were chemistry experts. But and then they said that Hezbollah, like in a way of explanation or making an excuse, the interviewer said, well, Hezbollah is shooting rockets or missiles at Israel out of sympathy for Hamas. And I don't know how Yaakov didn't lose his mind right there. So, that's the kind of thinking that seems to be very common in the BBC.
The BBC at least has a commitment in its charter to showing all due impartiality, not a mission that is necessarily followed up all the time. So how do we rank the BBC?
Poor,
which is disappointing because BBC's coverage as a global media empire is by and large stellar. But with Israel, there seems to be a certain black hole.
Not great on covering anti-Semitism in the UK either.
No, not stellar. Let's have a look at the next entrant, the Washington Post.
Also poor. The Washington Post has stood out as being very bad in the American media landscape. They stick to a very specific narrative that I find that they don't try to challenge, sort of their own narratives and their own assumptions about Israel. And this seems to be across the board on the editorial side and not just the reporting side, though we're talking more about reporting here. Okay,
so the Washington Post we're giving a poor rating. And next we have the Wall Street Journal. What do we make of the Wall Street Journal?
I think the Wall Street Journal has done a great job. Critiques here and there, but I think that they, again, like I said about training at Fox News, there are things that they report that are not necessarily the most comfortable for Israelis to hear. They don't necessarily make Israelis happy to hear them, but I feel like they give Israel a fair shot. They try to tell the Israeli side of the story and not only poor Gazans. They have a few reporters there who, as I said, I think that reporters who have made their lives in Israel, who have lived in Israel for a long time and plan to stay, tend to do a better job because they understand Israel more. And so they have some reporters there, Dov Lieber, Carrie Keller-Lynn, who, not just because I like them as people, but I think they do a very good job.
Okay, so the Wall Street Journal and also their editorials have also been very enlightening and incisive in ways that other editorials have not quite been so open to the Israeli narrative and therefore being more critical of their own countries, right?
Right. So
the role of the media is to hold governments to account. And the Wall Street Journal has actually been much more critical of the Biden administration, for example, but from the other direction.
Just like a little media gossip behind the scenes. So
please.
Editorial and reporting are supposed to be independent. Some places they're more, some places they're less. And in the Wall Street Journal, in general, in recent years, the newsroom and the editorial do not get along. The editorial is very, very conservative. They've been pro-Trump in the past, whatever it is, 8 years now. And the newsroom has complained about it. So the fact that at the Wall Street Journal, both newsroom and editorial are, I would say the newsroom is fair to Israel and the editorial is pro-Israel, it's not something we should take for granted.
Okay, so Lahav, if we are telling people where they should consume news that is fair and objective, we've ranked Wall Street Journal is getting a
high
quality from us. Fox News, and of course, since all journalists are biased, and so are you a little bit, what news source would you recommend people get their news from?
Of course, everyone should be reading Jewish Insider. Subscribe to our daily kickoff newsletter. We have everything you need to know about Jews and politics in Israel and in the US and beyond.
Lahav Harkov, this has been a fascinating discussion. How can people follow you?
At Lahav Harkov on Twitter, and of course, subscribing to Jewish Insider's Daily Kickoff.
Wonderful. Lahav, thank you very much for coming on State of the Nation.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with Jewish Insider Senior Political Correspondent Lahav Harkov. As always, please follow and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow on social media platforms as well. And we'll be back soon with more headlines that take us between the lines and beyond the headlines. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.